Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for ICCFA's Back to Business webinars. We are Live Oak Bank. If you saw the panelist snapshot there, Tim Bridgers, the head of our funeral home division at the bank, he is under the weather and fighting a virus, so he will not be here today, unfortunately. But we do have myself. My name is Andrew Kennedy. I am a loan officer for our funeral home team. I started at the bank in 2018 and have been here since, working solely in the funeral home division, working with first-time buyers, existing owners, discussing refinance projects, expansions, acquisitions, and a little bit of all the above. And then we also have here with me Jordan Coleman, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks everyone, like Andrew was saying, for joining the webinar today. I'm Jordan. I've been with Live Oak for about 7-8 years now. I closed funeral home loans for the past 5 years, or 5 years when I started the bank. Then joined Andrew and Tim on the lending side of things, and am now a loan officer in the funeral home space. So it's been a fun learning opportunity. So we're excited to have everyone on the call and kind of dig through what we see day to day.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jordan. So today we're going to be kind of focusing in on how to avoid costly mistakes. And we've got a good outline that we're going to kind of run through with you guys, whether you're a first-time buyer, own an existing funeral home or business, and are looking to expand. We've got some good information that we want to share with you guys and preparing to take those next steps when it comes to financing or pursuing your business goals or dreams. And before we get started, we do have a chat feature. Questions are welcome and encouraged. Please feel free to use that. We'll be monitoring that as we go, and we will be sure to answer every question we can during our time together today. So to kind of kick us off, again, focusing in on how to avoid costly mistakes. One of the first things we want to discuss is first-time buyers, what they can prepare for, what they can expect. So yeah, Jordan, anything when it comes to first-time buyers?
I would say we probably 60% of our portfolio is first-time buyers. Those first-time buyers typically come back for more acquisitions. So it's a great relationship and partnership to start and grow in the future. First-time buyers, I think a key point for these buyers is equity injection. Mm-hmm. So SBA, if you do go that route, which is what we typically advise for these first-time buyers, there's a 10% equity injection requirement. And that can be made up of a couple different ways. You've got your seller note as a potential option. And what that means is the seller can hold that entire 10% equity injection. The only caveat to that is it does have to be on standby for 2 years. After that 2-year mark is up, you can start getting principal and interest payments. The seller can on that day. So if you maybe didn't have that cash to put up front, that is most certainly a great option. And a lot of the times we see sellers like that option because they don't necessarily get the full lump on day one. So seller note is an option for that 10%. If you've got cash that you are able to put up for the 10% equity injection, that is most certainly an option. You can also look at potential outside debt. You could get a HELOC, or you've got something that is, any type of personal loan that you could utilize for the 10% equity injection. That is a potential option as well. And then, of course, you've got your investors. If you've got maybe a silent partner or an investor that wants to give you 10% in exchange for X amount of ownership, that's an option that you could rely on. Something that we do like to mention for investors if they are going to be part of the equity injection is, any individual owner that owns 20% or more of your operating company would have to guarantee that loan. So we do suggest, and we do see any type of investors giving the equity injection being below that threshold. So that way they're truly, silent investors.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have necessarily a party to the loan. They're just kind of helping you in the next steps of your goals. And then the last potential option is a gift. So if you've got a family member or a friend or grandparents, parents, whomever it may be, that is willing to gift you the 10% equity injection, that is an option that you could go down. I feel like we could talk about equity injection for days. You don't have to go one specific route. You can really make up your equity injection whichever way you're able to fulfill that 10% equity. And we're here to kind of help walk you through what those steps look like. It's just important to be transparent at the very front end so we can help you structure what that needs to look like or what your options can be based off of your resources.
Yeah, there are a few. Those are pretty much the main options. I would say the two most popular are typically a seller note or gifted funds. But at the end of the day, I think what we just wanted to make sure that we touched on here was that you can expect a 10% requirement when you're purchasing a business for the first time. But again, there are multiple ways in which we can achieve that. And that's something that we work with pretty in-depthly with each individual that's looking to buy a business. But we just wanted to make you aware of that requirement as you can begin to think about that if you do have goals of being a funeral home owner. Second, another kind of topic and something that we wanted to discuss was we're always doing a cash flow analysis. So we're always looking at the debt or the cash flow to see how much debt the business can handle. Whether you know a purchase price, maybe you don't know where to begin, we're going to perform a cash flow analysis. So it's always kind of a good idea, if you can, to be familiar with the business that you're buying. If you work at that business, you're probably pretty familiar with the business health from a financial perspective. But if not, that's okay too. If you don't work there and you just have an opportunity that you'd like for us to dive into, that's what we do. That's what we're here to do. But we always ask the question if you're familiar with any EBITDA adjustments for when you're buying a business, as that can be, really important when kind of determining, an overall health of the business you're buying and how much debt that business can take on. So for instance, some of the questions that we may ask you when you present an opportunity is, are there any expenses that the seller is running through the business that may be no longer an expense with the change in ownership? Sometimes we see personal vehicles. Sometimes we see
health
insurance, country club dues.
Maybe they pay, family members that aren't really part of the business, but that will no longer be an expense going forward. Mm-hmm. I think any personal expenses. Yeah,
absolutely. And then we also asked the question on if there are any kind of one-time in nature expenses. For instance, a new roof, repaved a parking lot, a new AC unit. These are things that do come up, but they're not a regular or an annual expense typically. So we do try to inquire as much as we can about the business that you're buying so we can make our cash flow as accurate as possible from a pro forma standpoint, putting the debt that you're borrowing against that cash flow to make sure that we're still putting you in the driver's seat to be successful. So EBITDA adjustments would kind of be bullet point number 2 behind equity. Again, just trying to understand the ins and flows of the business that you're buying and being able to kind of understand that those may be questions that we will ask for you to ask the seller. Again, I think those are just conversations that you can have. But again, that's something that will kind of guide you through when we have an opportunity to discuss with you. And then kind of lastly, Jordan, if you just want to touch on personal credit scores and maybe personal financial statements, those are 2 things that we'll look at, but maybe kind of some of the benchmarks when it comes to maybe a credit score and some of the things that we look for with that.
Yeah. So, credit is obviously an important factor for any type of lending and any type of loan. So any individuals that are going to guarantee our loan, spouses, anything of that nature, we will look at a credit score. Typically we like to see your credit scores, I would say 700 or higher. I think our minimum is 650 of a threshold. And just really, make sure that you are working your way to that type of credit score. If you've got a lower credit score and you've got an acquisition that you're maybe thinking of in the next 6 months to a year, start working on building that credit up and getting that credit score to at least a 650. 700 is really where we like to see it. But if you've got time to build that credit and work that credit score up, that is going to be something that helps determine, a loan decision.
Yeah, that's a great point. And then, too, I would also just add to that a personal credit score definitely doesn't define who you are or your character. Things come up in life and we understand that. And again, the more transparent you can be about your current situation or maybe where you were at that time, just the more we can understand you and the opportunity, so we can be prepared to meet with our internal folks to discuss that a little bit more in depthly. To Jordan's point, we also like to look at, your payment history, right? Are you able to pay your mortgage, pay your auto, if you have student loans, your credit card, all of these things? We want to see if you've been able to successfully pay those bills on time, because oftentimes that can translate to whether or not you can, pay back a business loan that you may be seeking. So credit score, but also just payment history, all of that kind of plays a role. And then when it comes to delinquencies and collections, obviously we do like to see, the cleanest credit report we can. But again, sometimes if those are on the credit report, we can be comfortable with those, but you could probably expect that those need to be settled or paid off prior to loan closing.
Yeah, I would say in with the expectation of us asking the question and getting a good understanding and story of why your credit score is the way it is, or why you've got these delinquencies or collections against it, just to get a better understanding of your current situation or historical situation, so that we can better assist you guys for the loan process itself.
Mm-hmm. That's great. That's great. And then kind of one of the last things that we do to kind of work alongside of the personal credit is we also ask for a personal financial statement, which you can find templates online. We have a form that we send to each of our applicants, but basically asking about cash, if you have a retirement, any stocks and bonds, just your ability to be able to save. So I would say, again, we've kind of seen it just about everything that you can imagine. So, again, the more transparent you can be and kind of setting us up with, just sharing what your current situation is, the better we can guide you, set realistic expectations, talk about things that we can implement to maybe improve, or share with things that we really like about it. But again, you could expect the bank to ask for a personal financial statement just to give you credit for what you've been able to build prior to becoming a business owner. Anything else with personal financial statement?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think you hit everything.
Cool. And then, so moving along, so that was our first time buyers, kind of discussing equity, personal credit, some EBITDA adjustments. Next, we kind of want to talk about existing business owners that are looking to expand, whether that be through acquisition of a business or expanding as a ground up. Like Jordan said before, a lot of what we do are helping our existing customers expand if that is their goal. Whether it's short term or long term, we always want to make sure we're positioning you guys for future growth and success, whether you just want one or multiple. So we wanted to spend a few minutes now kind of talking about what it would look like to buy, an additional business. One of the first things that would be one, we would want to see the health of your existing business, right? So being prepared to be able to provide us with the last 3 years of business tax returns, a current profit and loss and balance sheet, an existing business debt schedule, all of which we can see how you've been able to do as a business owner, and especially giving you credit for what you've been able to accomplish during your tenure as an owner, but also doing the same thing and requesting that information for the target business. Do you want to kind of hit on some of the the add backs and some of the process that
Yeah.
we really like to see on the target?
So the add back situation is going to be relatively the same as if you are buying your first acquisition. If you've got an existing business, mainly what your add backs would essentially look like are going to be more in the category of those one-time expenses, repairs for your actual business or roof or building that you currently own. So, any of those add backs help us to enhance that EBITDA number. So if you do run into that type of occurrence, just kind of keep track of what those add backs will look like and what they consist of, because that'll come back into play when you're ready to move forward for your next acquisition. On the target or the new side of the business that you're looking to purchase, it's going to fall into the same category as your first time owner that we explained. Any expenses related to the seller, that's going to be going away. One-time expenses on the property or anything of that nature, we'll be looking at for the target business. So just keep in mind that add backs, whether you're a first-time buyer or you're expanding and getting your second, third, fourth funeral home business under your belt, those are going to be a key factor and very important to us to help, set expectations of purchase price. We'll look at that EBITDA number and take the purchase price and look at a multiple that makes sense for both parties. So the more enhanced the EBITDA number and those add backs is going to help us accomplish what you and the seller are trying to agree upon. So if you're an existing funeral home owner, keep track of those add backs because they will come back to help us and help you in the long run. I would say another difference between your first time buyer and a second time or third time buyer is equity injection. So Andrew and I mentioned that first time owners, 10% equity injection requirement. If you are looking to expand and starting to grow, that's not necessarily the case. Typically, you are potentially eligible for 100% financing, so no cash down on the SBA route. If you're looking to expand, again, that does, play into what does your existing funeral home, debt service coverage look like? How do the trends of your business, we're really making sure that your existing business is performing since you've taken over that acquisition or for the past 3.5 years. So that is something to just keep in mind, that you are potentially eligible for 100% financing through an expansion.
Mm-hmm. Yep. If the ownership is being mirrored, whether you're creating a new entity or rolling it into your existing entity, as long as it's mirrored, you're technically eligible for 100% financing. You could still see the bank ask for a small but meaningful, and when it comes to equity. Again, it may not be a certain percentage, it may be case by case, but if you are interested in 100% financing and you do qualify, that is something that we do quite often if that is a attractive option to you. And then lastly, something else that we want to kind of maybe highlight is, be thinking about a business plan, right? So like if you own a funeral home, 30 miles away from the business that you're looking to acquire, what will the day-to-day look like for you? Where will you kind of be spending your time? What is the existing staff at your existing location going to look like? Are they going to be able or willing to kind of work out of both locations? Are you planning to keep the existing staff of the target business that you're looking to acquire? Are they going to stay intact? Are there any kind of potential cost savings from being able to utilize your existing business with some of the expenses that the new business may have? So just being able to kind of prepare to talk about a business plan can be really helpful, and something that kind of helps us understand what you're trying to do, so we can just help you best fit those needs. Yeah.
And I think you brought up a great point in your business plan. You're looking at what can, consolidating your expenses, that is a potential add back. Kind of going back to that, if not each funeral home, if you consolidate under one owner, is going to need two separate, insurance policies, two separate payrolls. So, that's something when you're looking at your business plan that you can help to consolidate expenses, cut expenses, and help that business grow really from day one, because you're able to consolidate your funeral home into one, owner.
Yep, that's a great point. Great point. So the third topic that we kind of wanted to highlight here today is talking about letter of intents versus purchase agreements. This is definitely something that can fall through the cracks, that often delays closing. These are just things that can be, quickly fixed, or kind of provide education on here today that can help keep our closing on track and avoid some costly mistakes. So any thoughts about letter of intent, maybe highlighting why we ask for it, when we ask for it in terms of the loan stage?
So a letter of intent is not necessarily when or where you need to get an attorney involved to draft. You most certainly, we highly recommend having an attorney for your purchase agreement and really ironing out specifics. But for your letter of intent, it's exactly what it sounds like. You're presenting an offer to the seller that you are interested in their business. It's essentially a non-binding agreement, but it helps us, it helps you guys, it helps the sellers understand that the buyer is interested in buying and the seller is interested to selling to the respective party, and that you guys have come up with some type of purchase price. That way you have an idea of what the business is essentially worth. The bank has an idea of how much we need to lend to, how to structure a loan. So a letter of intent is really just your intent of wanting to try to purchase the business. Again, non-binding. You essentially could draft this letter of intent yourself, just to present it to the seller and kind of move on to those next stages. But we do typically require a letter of intent before we get into underwriting. Again, it helps us to structure the deal and put the buyers in the best position that we're able to. You have anything else to add to a letter of intent?
Yeah, so typically, again, just to kind of echo what Jordan shared there, it's really your intentions to buy and the seller's intentions to share. We really like to see a signed letter of intent. It doesn't need to be drafted by an attorney, but it needs to show, if there's going to be a seller note, what amount, what are the terms of repayment, and then also purchase price. Maybe the total purchase price is $1 million. We're estimating the real estate portion to be $700,000 and the business to be $300,000, for example. But we really like to see that maybe sometime after we perform the cash flow analysis that we can review with you. If you're not sure really where to begin, our analysis can help you with that, and we can help maybe structure the deal and give you kind of some information about where would be a good price to kind of start your negotiations with the seller. But we really do like to see it prior to underwriting, just so we can make sure that we're underwriting to the actual deal, whether it's stock, whether it's asset, the right price, if there's a seller note, just to avoid any kind of confusion or kind of backtracking as the loan's moving forward, if there are any changes. So we like to just to have a clear outline of the letter of intent. I've seen them from a 1-pager to a 10-pager. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be that detailed. If you want to come in or share with the bank a letter of intent, which people do, that's great. But it's not necessarily something that you have to have before we begin talking. We just like to have it before we go into underwriting to get a formal approval.
Yeah. And like Andrew was saying, sometimes you find a seller that says they're ready to sell and you have no idea what a purchase price looks like. We're happy to kind of help assist. And what we do there is we do, like Andrew was saying, the cash flow analysis on that target business. And we say, listen, this is how much debt the business can support. This is kind of what we're thinking in a range of a purchase price, because it makes sense from a debt perspective. We want buyers to be, buyers in this business to be self-efficient. So we try to set you up in a position where the purchase price makes sense from a cash flow perspective. So again, if you don't have a purchase price or know what that looks like, we'll kind of help based off of the cash flow, and then you can start your discussions with what you're going to offer to the seller with a letter of intent.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yep. And then again, if you do have a letter of intent, again, the sooner it's received, the better. but just know that, the bank will perform its own analysis to make sure that we are putting you as the buyer in a position to be successful, making sure the debt can be repaid. You can pay yourself, pay all your expenses, and still have money left over.
The only other thing that I'll add on to when you're talking about purchase price, with kind of on the first stages, because we'll get into purchase agreements here in a minute, is to try to understand your allocations. Your allocations between the real estate portion of your purchase price and the business portion, because what you're allocating towards real estate and towards your business assets, which real estate's your tangible building, your business assets is your blue sky. It's the business itself, helps us to determine a loan term. If your allocations for real estate is 51% or more of the purchase price, you're eligible for a 25-year term. Anything below 51%, you're going to start looking at a blended term. So a transaction may not work if you're on a 12 or a 15-year term, but it may work on a 25-year term. So it's important to understand what you're thinking the allocations are going to look like. And essentially that's going to come from the seller. The seller's going to have a good understanding of what their real estate's going to be worth. So that's an important factor to think about and start, the conversations with the seller of what do they think the real estate is worth out of this purchase price.
Yeah, that's a good point. We'll spend a few more minutes kind of talking about real estate values and why it's so important. But I think the thing to kind of take away from what Jordan just said was real estate values play a major role, really, in regardless of the loan, SBA or conventional, regardless of the loan product, real estate value is going to be important. And we'll kind of dive in a little bit further why that is a little bit further along today. Next, you kind of just want to speak briefly about purchase agreements.
Yeah.
Purchase agreements are key and can really drive our closing date.
Yeah. So purchase agreements are typically or are always going to be when your attorneys are in the process. It's the sooner you have an attorney involved, obviously, the better, because they'll be able to help guide you and understand what's going on and not delay anything. The differences between the purchase agreement is they're going to be, extremely in-depth. They're going to be, you're legally bounding to that. Seller selling, you're buying, there's contingencies. There's a lot of different language, especially in this industry. It's very unique with everything it's got going on. So purchase agreements are typically drafted or started to get drafted during our closing process. And that is what's, closing takes the longest time. And I think we'll end up digging into that a little bit later on. But it's important to have an attorney draft a purchase agreement for you and for the bank to get a copy of that agreement, even if it's kind of in draft form, just to really check for SBA eligibility, making sure that everything makes sense, purchase price, that the buyer is being protected, the seller's being protected. So the sooner we're able to get that purchase agreement, the better.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's something too, purchase agreements in a lot of ways will help us set our closing date. So like we really, allow for 14 days after the purchase agreement to just make sure that everything is correct with the underwriting, the loan structure, everything matches with the purchase agreement that's kind of been shared with us. So again, the sooner we can get a purchase agreement in the bank's hands, the sooner we can review, the sooner we can make sure everything looks great, and then kind of talk more precisely about what a closing date would look like. A question that I get often is when to engage an attorney. Mm-hmm. And, how I like to answer that, it kind of depends on each opportunity. If it's a deal that we have a really hard closing date timeline or date that we need to meet, the sooner the better, right? The sooner we can start working on the purchase agreements, reviewing the letter of intent, working on creating entities, if that's a requirement, lease agreements, things of that nature. But I would say typically a good time to engage an attorney for the first time would be kind of during our underwriting process, right after we've given you the pre-approval letter, as we're kind of going through our 5 to 7 day underwriting time frame, that's really a good time to kind of engage your attorney and say, hey, I've got a business opportunity. I'm looking to buy either my first or another business, another funeral home business. That's really a good time to do that, because we want to make sure that, we feel good about the opportunity. Therefore, you're not spending more money or time elsewhere than you really need to be. We want to give you that confidence, that green light, and that will come when we give you the pre-approval letter. And again, that's kind of a week or two process between pre-approval letter and when you actually move into closing, when you can start having those conversations, letting them know they'll be needed, what the project actually is, and that their services will be needed for helping with the purchase agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like Jordan had mentioned before, accuracy and consistency is super, super important when it comes to purchase agreement. Again, just to make sure that everything aligns with what we underwrote, which kind of puts more emphasis on that letter of intent, trying to keep it as accurate as possible. But again, with the letter of intent, it is non-binding. We don't necessarily want that to delay us moving forward with the pre-approval letter or a formal notice of commitment to you.
Yeah, I would just say, try to have an understanding of what you think it's going to look like, your transaction. Is it an asset purchase? Is it a stock purchase? If you have your attorney start drafting something one way and then a week before closing, you end up wanting to change it another way, or maybe the seller wants to change it another way. That's going to affect your closing. It affects your corporate documents. It affects it affects a lot of things that it's better to understand and know what it's going to look like as best as you can on, the sooner the better.
Awesome. So we'll keep moving along here. But before we do that, again, just wanted to remind you guys that we do have the chat feature. So if there are any questions, you want us to better explain something, feel free to utilize that, and we'll be sure to answer any questions that are asked. Next, kind of continuing on the purchase agreements, any thoughts about the seller's kind of commitment to sell?
I would just say, sellers a lot of time depict the timeline. Mm-hmm. As everyone knows in this industry, when you have a business and it's, maybe it's been in your family for 3-4 generations and they don't necessarily have somebody to take over, or they're not interested and they're kind of selling to an outside party of that generation, there's a large attachment. So sellers, tend to be a little bit wishy-washy on, are they ready to sell? Do they want to? They do one day and then they kind of back out. What they want that sell to look like. So I think just kind of trying to gauge and understand the seller's commitment to, are they actually ready to sell? I would say it takes a while in this industry to get things moving with the seller that's very, very attached to the business.
Yeah, I think with that, having realistic expectations about closing timelines and dates, that is huge for actually avoiding these costly mistakes that we're talking about here. I think as soon as you know that there's an opportunity, as soon as you begin sending the bank any financials, anything that's kind of the loan application, I think it's really, really important to have those conversations about timeline, expectations, and that in itself can probably help you understand or get a better picture of what their commitment to selling is, right? Like if they can give you kind of a clear timeline and saying, this is kind of the window that I would like to sell. If they're not really fully committed to a time or really can't share that with you, that's something that you probably want to peg a little harder, trying to see what else you can find out about their actual commitment to sell. But that process in itself can kind of, delay closing and can be costly in the grand scheme of things. So really just trying to get on the same wavelength, having those conversations just to better understand what you as the buyer, what your goals are and what the seller's goals are, and then just trying to get on the same page so that can be shared with the bank so we can help meet everyone's goals when getting this done.
Yeah, and not to mention, as things drag out, your time is against you. But depending on how much time goes by, we've got to get updated interim financials. We've got to get reapproval with our credit team. Maybe that affects the purchase price down the line because the business has kind of trailed off a little bit. So, as things progress and the longer it takes, the more information we've got to start gathering. And then sellers kind of start to get irritated because we've got to keep asking for updated financials. So it's just a good thing to understand what the seller's timeline and expectation is, because that's going to be your timeline and expectation. So just good to have that conversation of what their timeline's going to look like.
So we kind of spoke a little bit about this, kind of given a little preview about real estate values, but kind of want to spend a few extra minutes here kind of diving into the significance and the importance of really trying to have an understanding of what the real estate values are. Again, Jordan kind of highlighted this before, but regardless if it's SBA or conventional financing, one of the first questions we're going to ask is real estate included? And if so, how many locations, and maybe what is a low end real estate estimate? It's always good to lowball the real estate for a couple different reasons. One being with SBA loans, as we shared earlier, the term in which you receive is solely based upon the allocation of the purchase price. What's real estate versus blue sky, business, goodwill, pretty much anything that's not real estate. If you qualify, if the real estate is 51% or more of the total purchase price, again, you qualify for the 25-year term. If it falls under 51%, you could really kind of range anywhere from a 10-year term to a 20-year term, depending on the actual percentage of kind of like a blended term for that. Again, even with conventional financing, we're going to want to be familiar with what the real estate value is when we start talking about a loan to value or loan to cost based upon what the real estate estimate is. Again, a part of our financing package or amount will be dependent on the real estate appraisal amount. But again, to set realistic expectations, to give you a clear picture on structure, we really want to know to the best of your ability what a value may look like. Mm-hmm. I think with that as well, again, you may be thinking, well, what if we don't know? Are there going to be third-party reports ordered? Who orders that? Does the bank order that? Does the buyer need to? Does the seller need to? That is a frequent question that we often get. And, the short answer is the bank will order all third-party reports, appraisals, environmentals, valuations after you've been formally approved, just to make sure that, you are good to go with the financing before any deposits are kind of collected to order those reports. But it will be appraised for the bank. The bank will order it. We do go through a kind of like a third party bidding process in which we use reputable companies all over the United States that are very familiar with funeral homes. And then they have certain people in those areas that will go out and appraise the buildings. But again, that's truly third party to help us get an accurate picture. But again, there's a lot of help that can be shared with the bank by understanding what a real estate value looks like.
Yeah, I would say the more transparency, the better, to structure and help every individual with the loan process.
Yeah, some of the kind of costly mistakes, if you will, can come from overvaluing the real estate. So, I guess kind of an example of what that may look like. Again, let's say that we are structuring an SBA loan for a first-time buyer. And, the agreed upon price, the numbers support $2 million, buyer and seller have agreed at $2 million. We've estimated the real estate to be at $1.2 million. Okay, so in this example here, that's more than 51% of the purchase price. So then you are eligible for the 25-year term, which obviously decreases your monthly payment, allows us to amortize the debt out for an extended period or a longer period of time. Whereas if we get that real estate appraisal back, and let's say that it's come in at $800,000, which again is less than 51% of the purchase price, now you're talking about maybe a 15 to 17-year term, again, based upon the allocation and the SBA formula that we're required to do. That can obviously change your monthly payments. Again, shortening the loan amortization would increase your monthly payment, which would make your cash flow a little bit tighter from a debt service coverage standpoint, which could change the purchase price, which could require the buyer to come in with more cash, or really renegotiate the loan structure. So again, all three of those are options that we really like to avoid, and you can do that by just trying to have an understanding of what the real estate value is, and again, communicating what would be a lower estimate.
Yeah. And we've come across it in the past where before individuals even get to closing, they want to order an appraisal. Obviously that cost needs to be paid up front, but we've had it before, they get too far into the process and these costly mistakes do come up, to order appraisals on the front end. So we've got a good, clear, accurate representation of what this value is going to look like. So that is, through a couple different cases, is something that we've done in the past. Mm-hmm. It looks like we've got a question. It's from Caroline. It says, aren't funeral homes worth more now in real estate than in cases? Are we referring to call volume cases?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Caroline, do you mind maybe trying to elaborate a little bit more on that? Maybe we're thinking that the real estate values are a little bit higher now than they were a few years ago, just with where everything is right now. So again, I think one thing that we will kind of touch on here is, a lot of times people will come to us and, they think if the real estate is appraised at $1 million and more than call volume. Yeah. So kind of an example here, sometimes people will come to us with a purchase price of $3 million. And that may be because, they have an appraisal in which the real estate was worth $2 million and they do about $1 million in revenues, and they think business $1 million, real estate $2 million, together $3 million purchase price. The real estate amount really doesn't dictate or determine the actual purchase price as much as it does the term. So the purchase price, again, is all going to be dependent on the cash flow, how much money is available to service the debt. We do lend in all 50 states, and we see really prominent real estate, in the Northeast, South Florida, West Coast, Southern California, in which, you may have a piece of real estate that's been appraised at $4 million, but the business only does 80 to 100 cases or calls on an annual basis, right? So when you look at it from that perspective, again, our financing amount is going to be based upon how much debt the business historically and today's numbers, how much debt it can take on, right? Just because the building's worth $4 million doesn't necessarily mean that, the purchase price, if you're buying the business as well, would be $4 million, because again, we would need to make sure that your source of repayment, how you're going to pay back this loan, is based upon the cash flow, not necessarily selling asset like the actual funeral home to repay the debt.
Yeah. And I would say probably this past year, just especially with the real estate market, the way that it is, sellers' expectations of a purchase price has exceeded what the business can support. So we try to help both parties understand, why we're getting to this specific loan amount. Like Andrew was saying, just because the real estate is inflated and is worth $4 million, the business cannot support that amount. So it's, conversations that we have, I would say, very, very frequently.
All the time.
To kind of try to help both parties understand and get on the same page of why, the business cannot support $4 million of a real estate debt when it only does 100 calls.
Yeah. And that's part of why we do what we do in terms of, coming to see you, doing a Zoom meeting, if there are time constraints. We always want to provide as much education and guidance as we can. And, if we kind of funnel a lot of our communication through the buyer. We've also gotten on the phone with buyer and seller. We've had conversation if the buyer has asked us to speak directly with the seller. I typically think it works best with kind of the borrower kind of communicating, or at least being a part of those conversations. But again, we really try to give the buyer a lot of education when it comes to this. You guys are great at what you do. If you bought a business, this may be, your main language. You may get this, but you also may be thinking, hey, we don't do this every day. Can you help us understand so we can share that with the seller? So we've seen it from all perspectives. Again, we try to understand where you are, meet you where you are. But again, we want to give you clear guidance and education so then you can have, a meaningful and productive conversation to the seller with kind of why you're able to offer what you can, and why what they're asking for may be a challenge. And again, that cash flow analysis is going to share a lot of good information with you. That's going to make that conversation, I think, a little bit easier for you.
Yeah, Caroline, great question. Does that answer your question? Give her a few minutes, but hopefully that helped answer your question regarding the real estate.
Yeah, really good question. Again, it helps us understand. It gives us a starting point, but it doesn't necessarily have much weight when it comes to what the actual purchase price may look like. And then lastly here, kind of our fifth and final topic, is we wanted to spend a few minutes kind of talking about the importance of having organized financial information, having that readily available. I think kind of sharing for a few minutes what we'll need and why we need it, and the importance of getting it as clean as possible, how that can, again, set right expectations and, help us avoid a lot of crucial mistakes throughout the process.
Yeah, I'll kind of kick us off there. So typically what we look for in both your existing business, if you own an existing business, and a target business, is going to be 3 years of tax returns, year-to-date interim financials, and those help us to get a good idea of the business's trend. Are they losing net operating margin? Are they gaining calls? Is it kind of leveled? So that's, those are our typical requirements right off the bat. For existing funeral homes, we'll look for a debt schedule to see how much debt the business currently has against it. And it's important to keep all of that organized and readily available. One, to keep the process moving, but two, for you to understand what we're going to be looking for. So you can talk to your accountant or get us in contact with your accountant. Again, really to keep things moving at a good pace for you and the seller. Those items help us to complete a cash flow analysis. So without those, we're kind of waiting to obtain that information from existing borrowers and or the target business or the sellers.
Yeah, I think it's as simple as if you know that there's a need for financing, I think, that probably doesn't happen overnight. That may be something that you've been thinking about or kind of planning for, whether you're building, want to buy a new retort, buy another business. I think as soon as that thought pops in your head, you should be working on your books, working with your accountant if you have one. There are a lot of great accountants in our space that would love to help with that. And even just making sure that, your call volume information is up to date with your pre-need information, the number of cases you guys have handled this year, kind of what's been cremation, what's been, a traditional burial service. So having that information readily available, it does wonders for the actual closing timeline. I mean, we see people that have their financials to us before we can even get off the phone, they've already emailed it to us. And then we have people that, can take months on months, depending on how much information they've provided to their accountant, or if we're waiting on the accountant. But again, I think trying to stay proactive versus being reactive when it comes to gathering the financials is super, super important, and something that can definitely save you a lot of time and a lot of headaches later down the road.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to also, make the seller aware from that first conversation that you have with them. Absolutely. They reach out to you or vice versa. hey, listen, I'm interested in buying the funeral home, or I'm interested in selling you the funeral home. Great. I'm going to need 3 years of tax return and your year-to-date interim financials at a minimum. That way they know what to look for, they know what to expect, and hopefully they're starting to kind of collect that information. Again, just so the process doesn't necessarily drag out longer than it really should. But there, on day one, your conversations, I would go ahead and say 3 years of tax returns, year-to-date interim financials. Would be a good starting point for the collection of documents.
Well said. Well, we have a few extra minutes here, so we just wanted to give you guys a chance again to utilize the chat feature. If you have any questions, we've already got 1 or 2 good ones so far. So just want to give you guys a few extra minutes. If you have any thoughts, questions, comments, we're here. And again, we want to thank ICCFA for having us. And we really appreciate what you guys do for our industry. And thank you for all the attendance throughout this year. Thank you for the ones that attended today. We appreciate you all. And again, we'll give it another 30 seconds or so just to make sure that no additional questions enter the chat. But just again, want to say thank you.
Yeah.
For you guys for being here and being with us.
Thanks, everybody.